Johnny in Lamarck, Texas. Hey, Johnny, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV.
Before I give you my question for Donald Trump, I have to say that every time I hear people defend the idea of a military draft using one of the pluses as encouraging cross-cultural understanding, mixing of races, and seeing the world, to me it'd be a lot cheaper and less troubling if we just spent money to send our citizens when they're 8 years old or 15 years old across overseas to study abroad, and that way they don't have to kill anybody in order to pay their way. It just seems kind of sick and twisted to me. It makes me cringe every time I hear that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, first of all, just because you have a military doesn't mean that you have to have wars. So I would put that on the civilian governance. It is Congress and the president that decide whether we're going to have wars or not the Army. Secondly, my suggestion and Charlie Rangel's and pretty much everybody else's who's on this, and which is a lot of progressives, the suggestion is that it would be a year of service to your country. It doesn't have to be military. You could volunteer to work in hospitals. You could volunteer to work as a teacher's aide. You could volunteer to plant trees. You would be paid for these things. We would be creating the equivalent of a civilian conservation corps. There are all kinds of things that could be done. And basically what it does is it gets you out of your local, parochial community where you're just, seeing the world through this little narrow area and you're seeing the rest of the country. And you have a rite of passage opportunity. This is something that's an actual important, identifiable, psychologically important, identifiable developmental stage in human growth, which is sometime, within 5 years after puberty, more or less. Young men and women need to go through a rite of passage where they make the transition from I'm no longer a child to now I'm an adult. And we have remnants of this from previous times, with the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah, with confirmation and Catholicism. There's all kinds of rites of passage. The initiations into a fraternity in college, or for that matter, graduating from high school used to be a major rite of passage in this country. Now, not so much. So, I think having somebody spend a year, whether it's in the military, if they're inclined or if they're willing, or whether it's in a civilian corps that is not at all military, and then in exchange for that, we give you a free education as far as you want to go. Yeah, Johnny.
I don't disagree with everything you've said, except the military part. I always cringe when I hear people bring up the defense of a military draft. I believe in drafting people into community service. That I'm okay with.
But here's the other reason for a military draft, Johnny. If your kids and my kids and the kids of half the members, the 535 members of Congress down the road from us, were all in the Army, do you think that George Bush would have been successful in selling us on a phony war in Iraq?
My answer to that is that's a nonsensical question because of the fact we know that the people in power always find a way to subvert the law. The law is for everyone else except them. So let's just dispense with that.
Well, that's arguable in the history of it. But, Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1952 saying he was going to end Harry Truman's war in Korea. And we didn't win that war. We fought it to a draw. And it was just like, and it was because there was a draft. And the young men who were in Korea, my uncle, my wife's uncle, my uncle-in-law was one of them, came back insanely wounded. I mean, psychologically wounded from that war, not to mention all the physical wounds. But it ended because of the draft. If there hadn't been a draft, if it had been entirely a volunteer military, where poor people were signing up because it was, the only option that they had other than just extreme poverty, then you would have the situation, I think we would have had the situation in Korea that we have right now in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're, 15 years into a war?
Thom, you just brought up something that reminded me of something one of your listeners brought up the other day about post-traumatic stress syndrome, as referred to in the more untraditional way of people exposed to long-term stress.
Right.
I think there is a valid argument to be made for that. And I use myself as an example since I'm a little bit younger than you. I think that the Vietnam War went on way too long, and the fact that there was a draft made a lot of anxiety for lots of people.
Oh, yeah.
Not everybody responds to stress by meeting the challenge. Some people shrink from it, and some people get definitely ill. And I think that is just as bad for the economy as a so-called voluntary war.
Right, and I don't disagree, and that's why had there been a draft at the beginning of the Vietnam War, keep in mind that LBJ did not turn the draft on until what year was it? 65? I'd have to go back and look. Maybe it was 66. But we had thousands of soldiers in Vietnam fighting before they started drafting people. And when he flipped the draft on, that's when the opposition of the war began. Prior to that, nobody was paying any attention. And
I was paying attention. I was 12 years old in 1971, and I said to myself, when the hell is this war going to end? It was really giving me stomach cramps thinking about that, because I did not want to go to be killed or be killed. I felt like fodder.
Yeah.
That's what it made me feel like, and I can't be the only one who feels this way.
No, you definitely weren't. I was 20 years old in 1971. I remember well, and I I remember my friends who were doing everything. Who had bad numbers for the lottery. They didn't, like Donald Trump. They didn't have a doctor who would doctor up a phony X-ray to show bone spurs that didn't exist. So they were doing things like staying up all night long and taking acid and not eating for 3 days, and then showing up for their physical, half psychotic and totally emaciated, or whatever. I mean, which is terrible. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that. But my point is, had there been a draft at the beginning, had there been a draft had the very first soldiers who went into Vietnam been drafted, I don't think I don't think LBJ would have expanded the Vietnam War. And that's my point. Johnny, you got to move along. We're never going to resolve this. We're dealing.
Get us out of it, and the Republicans still subverted it.
Yeah. But we're dealing with hypotheticals here. So,
I'd like Donald Trump to use his acumen from his business school and defend the privatization of the military.
Yeah, Donald Trump has no acumen, Johnny. But yeah, there you go. Thanks a lot for the call.